To have a war. Our planetary operators have two jobs. First, to gather and interpret data. Secondly, to keep the K factor negative. They were both on their feet now, moved by the same emotion. "And Himmel has a positive one that stays positive?" Costa said. Neil Sidorak nodded agreement. "Then let's get into the ship and get going," he said. It was a fast trip and a faster landing. The UN cruiser cut its engines and dropped like a rock in free fall. Night rain washed the ports, and the computer cut in the maximum permissible blast for the minimum time that would reduce their speed to zero at zero altitude. Deceleration sat on their chests and squeezed their bones to rubber. Something crunched heavily under their stern at the exact instant the drive cut out. Costa was unbelted and out the door, while Neil was still feeling his insides shiver back into shape. The unloading had an organized rhythm that rejected Neil. He finally realized he could help best by standing back out of the way while the crewman Grav lifted the heavy cases out through the cargo port into the blackness of the rain-lashed woods. Adeo Costa supervised this and seemed to know what he was doing. A signal rating wearing earphones stood to one side of the lock, chanting numbers that sounded like detector fixes. There was apparently enough time to unload everything, but none to spare. Things got close towards the end. Neil was suddenly bustled out into the rain, and the last two crates were literally thrown out after him. He plowed through the mud to the edge of the clearing and had just enough time to cover his face before the takeoff blast burst out like a new sun. "Sit down and relax," Costa told him. "Everything is in the green so far. The ship wasn't spotted on the way down. Now all we have to do is wait for transportation." In theory, at least, Adeo Costa was Neil's assistant. In practice, he took complete charge of moving their equipment and getting it under cover in the capital city of Kitezh. Men and trucks appeared to help them, and vanished as soon as their work was done. Within 20 hours, they were installed in a large loft, all of the machines uncrated and plugged in. Neil took a no-sleep and began tuning checks on all the circuits, glad of something to do. Costa locked the heavy door behind their last silent helper, then dropped gratefully into one of the bedding rolls. "How did the gadgets hold up?" he asked. "I'm finding out now. They're built to take punishment, but being dropped 12 feet into mud soup, then getting baked by rockets, isn't in the original specs." "They crate things well these days," Costa said unworriedly, sucking on a bottle of the famous Himmelian beer. "When do you go to work?" "We're working right now," Neil told him, pulling a folder of papers out of a file. "Before we left, I drew up a list of current magazines and newspapers I would need. You can start on these. I'll have a sampling program planned by the time you get back." Costa groaned hollowly and reached for the papers. Once the survey was in operation, it went ahead of its own momentum. Both men grabbed what food and sleep they could. The computers gulped down Neil's figures and spat out tape reels of answers that demanded even more facts. Costa and his unseen helpers were kept busy supplying the material. Only one thing broke the ordered labors of the week. Neil blinked twice at Costa before his equation-fogged brain assimilated an immediate and personal factor. "You've a bandage on your head," he said. "A blood-stained bandage." Little trouble in the streets, mobs, and that's an incredible feat of observation," Costa marveled. "I had the feeling that if I came in here stark naked, you wouldn't notice it." I get involved," Neil said, dropping the papers on the table and kneading a tired furrow between his eyes. "Get wrapped up in the computation. Sorry, I tend to forget about people." "Don't feel sorry for me," Costa said. "You're right, doing the job. I'm supposed to help you, not pose for the before picture in a home hospital ad. Anyway, how are we doing? Is there going to be a war? Certainly seems like one brewing outside. I've seen 2 people lynched who were only suspected of being Earthies." "Looks don't mean a thing," Neil said, opening 2 beers. "Remember the analogy of the pile? It boils liquid metal and cooks out energy from the infrared through to hard radiation. Yet it keeps on generating power at a nice steady rate. But your A-bomb at 0 - 1 second looks as harmless as a fallen log. It's the K factor that counts, not surface appearances. This planet may look like a dictator's dream of glory, but as long as we're reading in the negative, things are fine." "And how are things? How's our little K factor?" "Coming out soon," Neil said, pointing at the humming computer. "Can't tell about it yet. You never can until the computation is complete. There's a temptation to try and guess from the first figures, but they're meaningless. Like trying to predict the winner of a horse race by looking at the starters lined up at the gate." "Lots of people think they can." Let them. There are few enough pleasures in this life without taking away all delusions. Behind them the computer thunked and was suddenly still. "This is it," Neel said, and pulled out the tape. He ran it quickly through his fingers, mumbling under his breath. Just once he stopped and set some figures into his hand computer. The result flashed in the window and he stared at it, unmoving. "Good? Bad? What is it?" Neel raised his head and his eyes were 10 years older. "Positive. Bad. Much worse than it was when we left Earth." "How much time do we have?" "Don't know for certain," Neel shrugged. "I can set it up and get an approximation, but there is no definite point on the scale where war has to break out. Just a going and going until somewhere along the line." "I know. Gone," Costa said, reaching for his gun. He slid it into his side pocket. "Now it's time to stop looking and start doing. What do I do?" "Going to kill War Marshal Lomiord?" Neel asked distastefully. "I thought we had settled that you can't stop a war by assassinating the top man." "We also settled that something can be done to change the K-factor. The gun is for my own protection. While you're radioing results back to Earth and they're feeling bad about it, I'm going to be doing something. Now you tell me what that something is." This was a different man from the relaxed and quietly efficient Adeo Costa of the past week. All of his muscles were hard with the restrained energy of an animal crouching to leap. The gun, ready in his pocket, had a suddenly new significance. Neel looked away, reaching around for words. This was all very alien to him, and suddenly a little frightening. It was one thing to work out a K problem in class and discuss the theory of correction. It was something entirely different to direct the operation. "Well?" Costa's voice knifed through his thoughts. "You can, well, it's possible to change one of the peak population curves, isolate individuals and groups, and then affect status and location changes." "You mean get a lot of guys to take jobs in other towns through the commercial agents?" Neel nodded. "Too slow." Costa withered the idea with his voice. "Fine in the long run, but of absolutely no value in an emergency." He began to pace back and forth. Too quickly. It was more of a bubbling over than a relaxation. "Can't you isolate some recent key events that can be reversed?" "It's possible." Neel thought about it quickly. "It wouldn't be a final answer, just a delaying action." "That's good enough. Tell me what to do." Neel flipped through his books of notes, checking off the Beta 13s. These were the reinforcers, the individuals and groups who were K-factor amplifiers. It was a long list, which he cut down quickly by crossing off the low increment additions of multiple groups. Even while the list was incomplete, Neel began to notice a pattern. It was an unlikely one, but it was there. He isolated the motivator and did a frequency check, then sat back and whistled softly. "We have a powerhouse here," he said, flipping the paper across the table. "Take this organization out of the equations, and you might even knock us negative." "Society for the Protection of the Native Born," Costa read. "Doesn't sound like they're very important. Who or what are they?" "Proof positive of the law of averages. It's possible to be dealt a royal flush in a hand of cards, but it isn't very common. It's just as possible for a bunch of simpletons to set up an organization for one purpose and have it turn out to be a supercharged high-frequency K-factor amplifier. That's what's happened with this infernal SPNB, a seedy little social club dedicated to jingoists with low IQs. With the war scare, they have managed to get a hold of a few credits. They have probably been telling the same inflated stories for years about the discrimination against natives of this fair planet, but no one really cared. Now they have a chance to get their news releases and faked pics out in quality, just at a time when the public is ripe for their brand of nonsense. Putting this bunch out of business will be a good day's work." "Won't there be repercussions?" Costa asked. "If they are this important and throw so much weight around, won't it look suspicious if they are suddenly shut up, like an obvious move by the enemy?" "Not at all. That might be true if, for instance, you blew up the headquarters of the war party. It would certainly be taken as an aggressive move. But no one really knows or cares about this society of the half-baked native born. There might be reaction and interest if attention was drawn to them, but if some accident or act of nature were to put them out of business, that would be the end of it." Costa was snapping his lighter on and off as he listened to Neel, staring at the flame. He closed it and held it up. "I believe in accidents. I believe that even in our fireproof age, fires still occur.